Independence, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 4. I am not deceitful. Hello, husband.
Hello, troublesome and careless child.
All right, I guess I could be that sometimes.
There's only so much, you know. I know there was another term that's thrown around a lot in chapter 4, which is benefactress.
Yeah,
and
I could be your benefactress.
Well, I was thinking about that, but then I noticed that it seems like every term that I've called you so far is in referring to Jane. So I kind of want to keep consistent rather than just throwing around just a term for any
I guess I
character.
don't want to be in Mrs. Or I don't want to be like Mrs. Reed at all. So Halloween has just passed, and I just wanted to briefly mention that we dressed up as Jane and Mr. Rochester. This is a costume that we've had for a couple of years now, so it was fun to break it out again, and I put a picture up on Instagram in case anybody wants to see it.
When did you get that Jane Eyre dress?
Oh gosh, that must have been 2014. I got it on Etsy. I found a seller who made costumes, and I just sent her a picture of something Jane Eyre-ish, and then my measurements, and it was awesome.
Yeah. And I think it was our first Christmas after we got together that you asked for my measurements.
Yeah.
And I was like, what is this all about?
And I gave you a present that was really for me.
Yeah. Hey, how do you know I did not want a waistcoat vest that stops above my belly button and is and then long tails?
Yeah. I mean, any man would like to wear that, I'm sure. And obviously you look really good in it, so you should be wearing that.
Yeah. You're biased.
A little bit. So let's start off this episode with our SparkNotes summary of Chapter 4. About 2 months have passed, and Jane has been enduring even crueler treatment from her aunt and cousins while anxiously waiting for the arrangements to be made for her schooling. Now Jane is finally told she may attend the girls' school Lowood, and she is introduced to Mr. Brocklehurst, the stern-faced man who runs the school. Mr. Brocklehurst abrasively questions Jane about religion, and he reacts with indignation when she declares that she finds the Psalms uninteresting. Jane's aunt warns Mr. Brocklehurst that the girl also has a propensity for lying, a piece of information that Mr. Brocklehurst says he intends to publicize to Jane's teachers upon her arrival. When Mr. Brocklehurst leaves, Jane is so hurt by her aunt's accusation that she cannot stop herself from defending herself to her aunt. Mrs. Reed, for once, seems to concede defeat. Shortly thereafter, Bessie tells Jane that she prefers her to the Reed children. Before Jane leaves for school, Bessie tells her stories and sings her lovely songs.
Yeah, Chapter 4 is it's kind of more of the same, almost like a continuation. We've talked about it on previous episodes as well. It's like these chapters all blend together, where they could all be one big chapter, except for like what's different. Like I said, the first chapter was the incident with John and Jane. The second chapter is the Red Room. Third chapter is Mr. Lloyd. Now the fourth chapter is Mr. Brocklehurst.
Right.
And, Mr. Brocklehurst, and also something I put in my notes was that I really like how Charlotte really takes the time with the narrative to sort of show the daily life of Jane in this huge house. I always talk about how I'm more cinematic, Charlene, you're more literary, that you're always wondering how you need to get a feel for these characters. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, especially when movies, I feel like stuff gets rushed too often because you just want to hurry up and get, okay, here's what's happening. You know, we got to get going. Whereas in a book or in a good movie, you're like, I need to see some of what this person does on a day-to-day basis, or just how their life is, so that when drama is inserted, you know what a big contrast that is. You know, it's more meaningful to them to see them go through their arc and development. And so I feel like with Jane, you know, again, it was like, we're learning, okay, she's in this house with her aunt and she doesn't want to be there. Okay. And then there's a potential ghost in the attic from her uncle. And then there's an apothecary who's kind of taking care of her. And then I like with this chapter, she kind of goes into like this real big passage of time, right? Where she talks about, here's
Yes.
what we do. Months have passed. I do this. Bessie's doing this with me. Eliza and Georgiana are doing this. And you're kind of getting more of a feel, because otherwise it felt like, which happens with some of the Jane Eyre adaptations we've seen, is that it's kind of like vignettes.
Yeah, it
It's
moves
like-
very quickly in the adaptations for sure.
Yeah, it's like
They
we got to
gloss
get
it
okay.
over.
John's gonna pick on her. Then maybe we get the red room scene. You don't necessarily get the red room scene in a lot of
True.
the adaptations.
Yes.
But then here it's like, okay, now that's kind of what I appreciate the book
Mm-hmm.
over some of the adaptations, is
Yep.
because it's like, oh, I want to know about
Yeah.
19th century England and what kids were doing at that time as months passed. It's so easy to we got to hurry up and get to the next big thing. Which again, I do like that. When it comes to books, you're always thinking, what's the next character in the narrative? And we get it with Mr. Brocklehurst. And so it's like, you're just waiting to see who's coming next. But at the same time, it's like, don't short shift her development by telling us, what does she do on a regular basis? And how is she interacting with the kids after the incident with John?
Yeah, I feel like maybe if you wanted to speak to this as well, like older movies have that same sort of taking their time with the setup, with the character building, and then in the more newer movies, that's where you get, okay, straight to the action. They cut the credit scenes down and, it moves more quickly, where I also feel like with older books like Jane Eyre in the 1800s, before then, they did take their time telling the story, setting up these characters, kind of giving them, fleshing them out so that there's a bigger payoff, which is something that I feel is why I gravitated towards classical novels when I was younger, where I was just so enamored with this world that's really rich, that was set up in my mind by these books. And Jane Eyre does that perfectly. I feel like, you say that at least these first 4 chapters could have been maybe shorter, or, could have had some things taken out. But this chapter in particular is a lot of meat, a lot of things that definitely make the adaptations, because it's very important that we see Jane going to Lowood and what's the impetus. But I will say, it is weird that it takes so long for Mrs. Reed to finally call in Mr. Brocklehurst, unless she was, months have gone by, so unless she's looking for the worst school that she could, and cheapest.
Well, that's probably, if she's sending an apothecary to look after rather than a physician, then she probably wants to know what the cheapest school is. Or it's just, that's her punishment, is just, no, you won't get to go to school. And she's just
Maybe she was wrestling with the idea of like, oh, maybe I don't want to send her to school.
I think she's probably just dragging her feet.
Oh, yeah.
She's just being that, like, just twist the knife a little bit more.
That's
right?
true. And then, Jane just gets a little more annoying, where she's just talking back, and she's like, okay, time to send her off.
Yeah. And like you said, I think you have it in your notes as well. Like, we get to learn a little bit more about Eliza and Georgiana as well. And I'm wondering if this is maybe Charlotte Bronte trying to humanize them a little bit. And kind of, rather than have them just be John's accomplices, we get to see a little bit more of what they do. Eliza's like a little bit of a entrepreneur, I believe.
That's a positive way to spin it. Yes, the way that Jane describes it, she seems miserly.
Yeah.
But we do get to hear more about Eliza and Georgiana when they're older, and I think it's interesting to see them as young children and see what that translates to as adults, because I feel like Charlotte Bronte really brought that full circle, where you're like, okay, I could see them growing up to be these types of people.
Bookending it, foreshadowing it, almost like you said.
Sure, yeah, that's right, foreshadowing.
Yeah.
So then we are introduced to Mr. Brocklehurst.
So we have if you want to call him a villain, we have a
new
nefarious character.
Oh yeah, a new one, because we already had John, we already have Mrs. Reed. There's just so many villains in these in this beginning chapters.
Yeah, we have Mr. Lloyd in chapter 3, who was like, okay, he's a better one. And now it's back to now we have another negative character, but somebody who's imposing and somebody who's very, for lack of a better word, I'll say very literary. Just like some sort of like it sounds like a villain of a 19th century Gothic novel.
Especially the way that Charlotte Bronte describes him, which I really love. Describes him as a black pillar, and his grim face at the top was like a carved mask, and the line with what a face he had, now that it was almost on a level with mine, what a great nose and what a mouth and what prominent teeth. What do you think that reminds you of?
That was like total Red Riding Hood.
Yeah, Big Bad Wolf. Saw that.
Like I literally had to pull out my phone and kind of go on Wikipedia and be like, when was Little Red Riding Hood written? Wow. And I saw that it was like, it goes back to like the 1600s, and then the Brothers Grimm did their first version in like the early 1800s. So perhaps Charlotte might have been aware of it. I saw that there was like the Brothers Grimm did a later version that came out after Charlotte had already passed away. But I'm wondering, like, how
I know there's a French fairy tale writer, folktale writer named Perrault, I think. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right. He also
is it Perrault?
It's probably, yeah. But he also wrote Bluebeard, or popularized that fairy tale. So that's also a fairy tale that gets actually direct mention in Jane Eyre. So really? I believe Charlotte Bronte was definitely familiar with these fairy tales. And I think the Big Bad Wolf suits Mr. Brocklehurst.
Yeah, he is that wolf in sheep's clothing kind of a thing, right? Where he's supposed to be seen as this dignitary, this figure of authority. And you're going to find out later that he, now I don't know if he comes into the house and tries to sell Mrs. Reed on this bill of goods that, we'll take care of her.
Probably.
But at the same time, like, doesn't it seem like Mrs. Reed doesn't care? Like, she's like, she probably wants her to be mistreated at this school.
That's
so she doesn't mind that. Like, he can say, she'll be fine, but she's kind of like, whatever.
I hope she didn't really know how bad it was at Lowood, where maybe she said, okay, well, at that price that I'm paying, which is probably nothing, this is going to be a good deal, and she's going to get a decent education, and I don't have to see her because they will keep her for the holidays as well.
I noticed that was part of the line. She said, doesn't she say make sure for every vacation to keep her there, right? Yeah. And who knows? I mean, I joked about it before, but there's been a couple times when I was off in college where we had, I think it was one year, we had a spring break, and I paid extra to stay in the dorm. They gave me a separate key to get into the building, and then I just I didn't want to go back home because all my friends were in college. Now, granted, they all left to go to their home, but I liked my college town more than I liked the town where I was living with my parents, because I didn't grow up there. We moved there after I finished high school and stuff. And so when I went off to college, it was much more exciting to stay in that town, even though it was the middle of a snowstorm, and it was kind of like The Shining, where it was like I was stuck in this big empty dorm. But the cafeteria was open. They had like a very minimal staff in the cafeteria.
Okay. Did you have burnt porridge? That's going to be another reference for later.
I'm trying to think I think I mentioned it to you before, but it was like I woke up, I worked on I had to write a term paper. I worked on a term paper, then I would take a nap, then I would eat lunch, and then I would work in the paper a little bit, and then I would take a nap.
It's like a perfect day.
Yeah, take a shower, then go out. One of my friends was down the hall. He did the same thing, and there was a couple of us in the dorms, but it was really eerie. And like I said, you look out the window, and it was just snow-covered area.
That's also a little Lowood.
Maybe that's what Lowood's like. Yeah, maybe she might not mind being there for their vacation, especially if she makes some friends that are more personable and fun with her.
I'm sure she'll have more fun at Lowood than she would, as long as she doesn't catch a cold or something worse. So I believe that, there's I think I mentioned before, there's a lot of moments of humor in Jane Eyre, and I always think it's great that in the adaptations, and every time I've seen Jane Eyre as a play, there's one big laugh line in the show, and it's always when Mr. Brocklehurst asks Jane where the wicked go after death, and Jane's reply,
"Do you know where the wicked go after death?"
"They go to hell, sir."
"And what is hell?"
"A pit full of fire, sir."
"And should you like to fall into that pit and burn there forever, child?"
"No, sir."
"What must you do to avoid it?"
"I must keep in good health and not die."
Oh, that Jane. She's
young Jane, so precocious.
She's just a little firecracker.
I mean, maybe, I guess that's a way to not go to hell, is to not die.
Yeah.
There you go.
Live a good life.
Problem solved.
Live a good life on Earth. Try to be the best person you could be.
I think probably be a vampire. That's the way you're gonna...
Or, like, you and I just don't believe in it. Then you don't have to worry about it.
No, there's nothing to worry about.
What happened? But do you, like I said, but is that something that you've read a lot of literature of that era? Do you think that that's they make humor out of something like this, out of religion, out of deeply held religious
I think
beliefs.
about hypocritical religious figures that preach something and they don't follow through, which is something you definitely get with Mr. Brocklehurst. Perhaps you don't feel that right now, but I do think that the way that he talks to Jane, which is so patronizing and sort of demeaning to children, like he has this book that tells little kids where they go when they die, and it's just tales of terrible stories of little Martha was mean to her mom, and then the devil took her away. That's not really very helpful to kids.
Like they feel like they had to shame them into being good.
Yeah, or to scare them, which is like, I feel like Charlotte Bronte didn't think of God as being something to be feared like that, and that's where Mr. Brocklehurst and his ilk maybe taught that.
There's a lot of people who probably do feel that way, right? You always hear that term, the God-fearing Christian, God-fearing Catholic, right? Like,
yeah.
Like it's supposed to be full of love, right? But yet,
yeah. And then Mr. Brocklehurst mentions his son, who, after Jane says she doesn't really like the Psalms, then he tells her the story of his son, who is asked apparently multiple times of would he rather read a psalm or get a gingerbread nut. And so the son says he would like to read a psalm, and so he gets 2 gingerbread nuts. And it seems to me like the son knows what he's doing here.
You think that is?
I think so.
Honestly, that he is really that into the Psalms, or is Mr. Brocklehurst just fibbing a little bit?
Oh, no. I think that his son realizes that that's what his dad wants to hear. And he's like, I could just get 2 gingerbread nuts if I say I want to read a psalm.
Yeah. I thought it was funny, and I put in my notes that it kind of reminds me of Ned Flanders' kids. Rod and Todd. If you ever watch The Simpsons, they're like little versions of Ned, and it kind of reminds me. And I don't want to get off on.
But they're earnest, like they're good kids. They're not. I feel like this is the son. Mr. Brocklehurst's son is kind of playing him.
Really? Okay.
Oh, I mean that's We
never meet Mr. Brocklehurst's son, do we? Is he?
No,
turn
we
up?
don't.
Okay, we have secondhand accounts from Brocklehurst, but yeah. But it kind of, like I said, with Rod and Todd Flanders, it always reminds me of something. And I said I don't want to get too deep of a tangent, but one of the issues I've always had with religion is that it seems like a lot of it is based on what your parents believed in. I feel like kids at some point, I don't know what point that would be, 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, should have a choice, should see what all the different religions are out there, or lack of religion, and then decide which suits them. I feel like too many times couples will have a child and then got to bring the child to the same church we go to, and got to make sure they're there every Sunday because that's what we do. I can see that it's
difficult, but that's their belief, so it's hard to say. It's hard to believe something like that and think, and be that open-minded of like, these other religions exist, and maybe my child would like this more. That's not the nature of religion.
Yeah, and I feel like too much of it is just they want their kids to follow the same religion they do and follow in the same path, which I guess most parents, I assume, we always talk about it on this show. We don't have children, but you want your kids to be somewhat similar to you. You want them to break out on their own, but you also want to lead them to on the right path. And a lot of times, people who are very religious feel that religion is the right path.
Their religion,
their particular religion, and so that's why it always makes me a little nervous. You always say whenever there's serious hot button issues in this country that have religious bent to them, we always say, once these generations go by, it'll start swinging the other direction because those people will die off. But it's like not necessarily, because if they keep pushing their kids into the religion, who keep pushing their kids into the same religion, they're going to have the same views about some of these issues. But so I wonder about Brocklehurst's son. I still think it. I think maybe he's just making that up. I think he's making it up. I really think that's just a secondhand account that he can tell Jane.
Mr. Brocklehurst wouldn't lie.
It's a white lie though. It's more just like it's exaggerating the truth. Maybe the kid's like, I want the gingerbread nut, and he's like, you sure you don't want the psalm? I'm like, I want the nut. And then he's just like, well, you read the psalm and you'll get the nut. And then he's like, okay, sure. And then the kid reads the psalm, and then Mr. Brocklehurst can tell everybody, my kid
wanted
read the psalm.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, I guess that's leave a comment, dear listener, and let us know.
What do you think? If Mr. Brocklehurst's son really wanted to read the psalm, or did he just want the gingerbread nut? Brocklehurst sounds like, like you said, I guess we'll get into this as well, and I'll ask you, is it true that Mr. Brocklehurst is based off of a real person?
Yes, and this is a person that Charlotte Bronte knew as a child because he was the superintendent of the clergy daughter school at Cowan Bridge, where she went to school. It was a school that provided low-cost education for the daughters of poorer clergy, and Charlotte and Emily, along with their older sisters, Marie and Elizabeth, went to that school.
Now, you said poorer clergy, so Patrick Bronte was not...
Oh, no, they were...
on the low end?
Yeah, they were lower class.
Oh, okay.
They were well-to-do, but they just didn't... Haworth was a poor parsonage, so they didn't have a lot of money.
And he had the apothecaries looking after the kids rather than physicians.
Possibly, I don't know. Yeah. But they also had a lot of kids, so there was a lot of mouths to feed.
Well, sure. And unfortunately, he did need to have physicians for the kids, because didn't the kids get sick while they were in school?
Yeah, so Maria and Elizabeth, the two older sisters, they contracted tuberculosis at the school and died a year after they were admitted. They actually came home at that time, and then they died at home. So Charlotte had that memory of her sisters getting sick at this school, and she didn't have a lot of good things to say about this school. And
didn't you said Patrick, didn't he pull Charlotte and Emily out of the school?
Yes, and they taught them at home, I think, for the most part.
I wonder if that was common back then. Yeah, I wonder if that's just...
I wonder. I mean, Patrick had help because he had his wife's sister there with them. So, I don't know. If you didn't have help like that, then that would be difficult. But...
Yeah.
So yeah, I find that very sad, and so Mr. Brocklehurst was based on Reverend William Carus Wilson, and he also wrote a book warning children away from sin called The Children's Friend, which brings to mind Brocklehurst giving Jane a book called Child's Guide. So I think Charlotte Bronte was making a pointed statement.
Yeah, a little on the nose. I think you told me off the air that you're like, oh yeah, Brocklehurst is based off a real person. When as soon as I read that in your notes, and I'm like, he also wrote a little book that was just like the one that pamphlet that Jane was just discarding.
I do wonder if Charlotte read that book or she just heard about it, but she probably flipped through it, especially if she went to that school. Maybe everyone got a copy.
Oh well, yes.
But it also, a few months after Jane Eyre was published, Charlotte Bronte wrote a letter to her publisher, and she said, Jane Eyre has got down into Yorkshire. A copy has even penetrated into this neighborhood. I saw an elderly clergyman reading it the other day, and had the satisfaction of hearing him exclaim, why, they have got blank school. And I should explain that a lot of the times these names were redacted for the sake of not revealing who they were. And Mr. Blank, here I declare, and Miss Blank, naming the originals of Lowood, Mr. Brocklehurst, and Miss Temple. He had known them all. I wondered whether he would recognize the portraits, and was gratified to find that he did, and that moreover he pronounced them faithful and just. He said too that Mr. Blank, Brocklehurst, deserved the chastisement he had got. So I believe that Reverend Wilson did hear about this portrayal of him in this book by this anonymous person, because I don't think Charlotte Bronte was known yet at that time. So I think he had sued for defamation.
Did they sue?
Yeah, I don't know if that... I can't...
Sued Kerr Bell?
Yes, and I think his son also wrote something in defense of his father. I'm sure that Reverend Wilson did some good works, like probably Mr. Brocklehurst did. He had some power and respect in that community. It's just that he was very misguided in a lot of his thinking and his treatment of children, and that's what led to this portrayal of Mr. Brocklehurst.
And I'm sure that Reverend Wilson's son, when he wrote his defense of him, talked about how much he loved the Psalms.
Oh yeah,
and did not want gingerbread nuts. It's true. Someone can like Psalms more than gingerbread.
He said, yeah, that particular part in Jane Eyre was absolutely true, but everything else about Mr. Brocklehurst, not true at all.
No. Well, like I said, it's easy to paint him as a villain, right? I feel
it's very easy, yeah.
Because especially because you're looking at the first person perspective of a 10-year-old child. But then I like how we talk about how sometimes some elements of Jane Eyre are timeless, and this is like what person went to school and liked the principal, right? Even if you're not in a like one of these kind of schools back, from the 19th century.
Well, you know what they say: principal You can tell. I could spell the word. Principal is your pal.
I've
never heard that. Oh.
I mean, I'm sure when I was younger, I think it's just, who likes the principal? I probably, when I was in high school, maybe I kind of
I don't know.
But when you're that age, I'm like, when I was in grade school, I don't know.
I had anything against the principal.
I'm not saying like dislike, but I'm just saying you just did, but you didn't like them.
Oh, no, I don't know. I don't know about that. I don't know if that's a universal feeling. So we're focused on Mr. Brocklehurst, but there's someone who's emerging as sort of a positive person in Jane's life that we didn't initially perhaps see, which is Bessie. That all of a sudden now she's a little bit nice to Jane, and Jane appreciates that. Do you automatically
associate her with Mrs. Reed because she's on the staff and she's paid by her, and so you want to think of her as like another authority figure towards Jane?
But Bessie can be a little harsh and speak sharply, and then I think there's like even a couple of moments of like Jane being by herself and Bessie goes and leaves her because she wants to go hang out with the other servants, and she doesn't want to be burdened with little Jane, which she doesn't have to be.
Sure.
It's understandable. She has her own life, but you feel a little bit sad for Jane.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I wonder at some point, I don't care who you are, you're going to have a heart. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure Bessie sees the mistreatment, and so she's going to have to try to look after her. But at the same time, like you said, if she's busy, if she's got 3 other kids, she got to look after. And I'm sure if she doesn't tend to them fast enough, she's going to hear it from Mrs. Reed.
Sure, yeah.
And I don't know how easy it is to find another gig like that in that era. And so, like, are we going to get to see more from Mrs. Abbott, or is that just?
No, not really. She's not. She doesn't come into the picture, but
I am enjoying, and I am enjoying. I'm starting to get to where I really enjoy the interactions that Bessie has with Jane, just because it's a nice contrast to the interactions that Jane has with the Reed children. But
and it's not like Bessie is not overly sweet. Sometimes you can think of children as being angels, and Bessie seems to have a very level head, where she treats Jane as a job. She's not overly enamored with her. She doesn't want to have to take care of her. She doesn't have to. And, again, that's fair.
Well, and I think maybe she's also stern for a reason, too, and that is kids will walk all over you if you don't lay down some ground rules. And I'm sure she probably has to deal with the other 3 kids who think they can get away with anything.
It's hard to turn it off for the one good child.
Yeah. So it's like I wonder if this is her chance to have a little bit of a power trip.
Oh,
because I mean, in a bad way. I mean, just like the fact that
it's easy to tell Jane what to do, and she does it, and you don't have to think about it anymore.
Yeah. Whereas if she tries to be too strict with the Reed children, they're going to tell Mom.
I see. Yeah.
Whereas I feel like with Jane, she's just like, whatever. Jane's not going to be able to say anything. Mm. And even if she did say something to Mrs. Reed, I'm sure Mrs. Reed would be like, okay, that's fine.
Here's your bonus, Bessie.
Yeah, exactly. She might score some points, but yeah.
So yeah, we can wrap up, I think, with this episode. We usually end with our meaningful passage or quote, and I'll go first this time. The quote for me is, "Even for me, life had its gleams of sunshine." And it's the last line of this chapter, which I like because it just shows this sense of hope in Jane Eyre for maybe the first time. And, it's leading into her going to Lowood. She obviously had it out with Mrs. Reed, so she got rid of some of that negative feeling, got to express herself. It's also a little indicative of how we all feel sometimes, of life being an assortment of good and bad things. So it's just such a neat, quick quote encapsulating all that. Yeah,
I feel like you can almost put that into the earlier part of the chapter where she's discussing her daily life. Like, talking about the months go by, but she seems to find some little joy, right? She has her doll.
Right. She has her doll. She has some books.
Yeah.
She just plays quietly by herself.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good idea. I like that. You're right. It's the last line of the chapter, right? And we've had 4 really somewhat brutal chapters in a row where you're hoping maybe you don't know what's coming ahead at Lowood, but at least it's can't be worse. You would think.
Yeah, you would think.
I mean, you're going to discover that I guess it could be, but there's still. I like you should always have that positive aspect. Something I always tell Charlene a lot off the air is that you should always have something to look forward to. And there's moments, we all go through moments like this where you have ups and downs. And there was a movie that I watched not that long ago. It was The Muppet Christmas Carol. And I had to watch it for the other podcast I do about Disney films. And there was a line in the film where one of the characters says, every day's a gift.
Oh,
and it's just
right.
it's such a quick little line, but it's just something I think about a lot. Where you always wonder about
Some Muppet wisdom for you.
Yeah. You ever having a bad day? You got to realize that your parents decided that to put you here. And it's like you're here for a reason, and it's a gift. You're a gift to them, and you said, what did you say? Gleams of sunshine every year. Gleams of sunshine. That's a good positive aspect.
Mm-hmm. So your quote.
My quote, and I got a good one just because I love, this is just really good with Charlotte Bronte's way of turning a phrase. She says, quote, "Something of vengeance I had tasted for the first time, as aromatic wine it seemed, on swallowing, warm and racy. Its after flavor, metallic and corroding, gave me a sensation as if I had been poisoned," end quote. And it's kind of referring to when she has her confrontation with Mrs. Reed.
Right.
And I like that idea of, it's nice to finally get it out, but at the same time, I think something people don't realize a lot when it comes to expressing anger. One of the unfortunate side effects of showing a lot of anger is that it's probably not good for the blood.
Right.
It's not good for your.
You're putting yourself in a negative space.
Yeah, and you don't want people to bring you down. And I feel like we're gonna talk about should Jane feel bad about the way that she spoke to Mrs. Reed? And I'm thinking maybe kids should feel some sense of guilt sometimes, even if they're right, because there's a time and a place. But then, as we discovered with this, when would that time and place be?
Right.
So I can forgive her for that, but I can give credit to Charlotte to writing that line where Jane does feel a little bit like it's
The
nice to get it out,
reaction,
but then she's still kind of like, ugh. Why did I do that? And then what makes it worse is, she makes a comment about she doesn't want to apologize to Mrs. Reed because it's only going to make it worse. And I was thinking would that make Mrs. Reed more smug?
Probably.
And that's the last thing you want. Yeah.
You think I can do without one bit of love or kindness, but I cannot live so. I will never call you aunt again. And if anybody asks me how you treated me, I will say the very thought of you makes me sick, because you treated me with miserable cruelty. That is the truth, Mrs. Reed.
Jane, you are passionate. Go to the nursery, there's a dear. Go and lie down a little.
I'm not your dear. I cannot lie down. Send me to school soon, Mrs. Reed, for I cannot live here.
I feel like it's very thought-provoking to think. For my part, I feel like Mrs. Reed deserves what Jane said to her so much that I feel it's a little funny that Jane would feel so scared, unless sometimes I wonder, well, maybe she thought, since I said these things to Mrs. Reed, now she's not going to send me away to school and she's going to make my life worse. Yeah. So she's a little afraid of that. But and I think this is probably part of Jane's character, which, you get to know that Jane has this element of wanting people to like her, so that if she's gets into an argument with someone, then it doesn't feel nice because she put herself in a place of this. Now Mrs. Reed will hate her more, and she just doesn't like that feeling.
Well, and like I said, we talked about it, I'm sure we have before, that Charlotte is making her out to be as well-rounded as humanly possible. The previous chapter, she hits us with Jane having these really strong opinions about poor people, but then says, well, poor people were responsible for her parents. Maybe that's how parents' death. Maybe that's how she feels about it. And here we finally get this moment. You've been leading up to this for 3 chapters now, where she finally lashes out. Yeah. And as a reader, it's easy to be like, that's what she deserves, like you said. But then at the same time, Charlotte pulls it back in and says, no, Jane shouldn't feel like that. A 10-year-old should have a little bit of remorse.
Yeah, a little more respect for her elders too. I think there's some of that in there.
Yeah, and even if they are terrible, but she still has a roof over her head and feeds her, whatever, So
yeah, I guess. Well, Jane didn't feel bad about attacking John, which makes sense because he deserved that for sure too.
Not an elder.
And they're equals.
Yeah, and sometimes kids need to be put in their place, or like bullies. We were talking about that. You should stand up to a bully. Mrs. Reed is a bully, sure, but she's also the benefactress. So
yes. So yeah, that's a great quote. I think that's also a quote that stands out to me in adaptations. I think I speak a lot about adaptations, but I really love how adaptations pick and pull different parts of Jane Eyre and how they create the story. And it's interesting to see what parts are important to telling that story. And I think that Jane's reaction to Mrs. Reed is going to set up some kind of personality elements that you might see in later chapters.
Yeah, and that scene gets played up so much in the film adaptations because it's a strong confrontation. It's very dramatic. It's very cinematic too. You know, it's the I'll never call you my aunt and I'll never see you. You know, that whole thing. I feel like Charlene and I have watched all 37 adaptations of this, and it seems like that's one that always seems to make it in there.
Yes.
And the difference being like, how soon is it? You know, is it a 2-hour movie? Is it a 4-hour, 5-hour unabridged BBC miniseries version? You know, and I feel like I'm sure that the Colin Clive, Virginia Bruce version that's 75 minutes long probably still makes time for that scene. Top of my head, I don't know. I'll have to watch that again. Report back.
So I think that's it for chapter 4. We covered the Brocklehurst and the confrontation with Mrs. Reed, so now Jane gets to go to Lowood in chapter 5.
We're pushing the narrative forward. Now we have a chapter where we get a new character. Now we have to get a new setting. And that's what happens when you read books, right? What's the next setting? Where's the next locale? What's the next scenario going to be there to drive drama? Drama is the life with all the boring parts taken out, or whatever. Is that what they say?
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram @AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all of the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter @MikeDeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.